Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into something pretty controversial.
Yeah.
It's a group called the Science of Identity Foundation,
Okay.
or SIFE, and it's led by a guy named Chris Butler. You may have heard of him. He's also known as Siddhaswarupananda Paramahamsa.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Right. It's a lot.
It is.
And this group, SIFE, it's kind of like an offshoot of the Hare Krishna movement, but with some unique and, let's just say, controversial
It's
elements.
definitely controversial. There's been a lot of talk about potential cult-like practices within SIFE and accusations of manipulation and exploitation.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to dig into today. We've got a ton of sources, former members' accounts, court documents, news articles. We're going to try to separate fact from fiction and get to the bottom of what's really going on with Chris Butler and SIFE.
Sounds like a fascinating deep dive. I'm ready to get into it.
Me too. So before we jump into the heavy stuff, maybe we can just kind of set the stage.
Yeah.
Like, who is Chris Butler and how did he end up leading this organization?
Sure. So Chris Butler, he was born in 1948 in Washington, D.C., and he actually got involved in the Hare Krishna movement pretty early on in the 1960s.
Yeah, he was just a teenager then, right?
Yeah, and he quickly rose through the ranks. He was a charismatic speaker, a gifted musician, and he seemed to have a knack for attracting followers.
I read that he even started using the name Sai, claiming that Krishna himself had bestowed it upon him.
Right, but it turns out Sai was actually part of his initiated name from the Sivananda ashram where he'd studied earlier, so maybe not quite a divine revelation there.
Interesting. So he was already crafting his image early on?
Seems that way. And that kind of self-promotion and image-making becomes a recurring theme throughout his story.
Okay, so he's this young up-and-comer in the Hare Krishna movement. What happens next?
Well, he ends up moving to Hawaii and actually becomes a pretty prominent figure within ISKCON. That's the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, the main Hare Krishna organization.
Right. I know ISKCON has a pretty big presence in Hawaii.
Yeah, and Butler played a big role in building that up. He brought in a lot of money, property, and a significant group of followers.
Sounds like he was a real asset to them.
He was for a while. At least that's how it seemed. But then things took a turn in the 1970s. There was a split. Butler broke away from ISKCON and started his own organization, which eventually became SIF.
What caused the split?
There are different versions of the story. Butler claimed there were plots against him, people within ISKCON trying to kill him.
Wow, dramatic.
Yeah, but the founder of ISKCON, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, he dismissed those claims as childish. He basically said Butler was making it all up.
So there's already this conflict, this us versus them mentality emerging.
Right, and that becomes a key part of Butler's narrative. He positions himself as this martyr, this enlightened leader who's being persecuted by corrupt forces.
And that kind of narrative could be really powerful. It creates a sense of loyalty among his followers, makes them feel like they're part of something special, something that's under attack.
Exactly, and that's when things start to get really interesting. Because once Butler breaks away from ISKCON, he starts to develop his own unique teachings and practices.
Right, and that's where the whole science of identity thing comes in.
Yeah, and this is where the potential cult-like elements start to become more apparent.
So what exactly is the science of identity? What do they believe?
Well, it's a bit of a mix of things. They draw on traditional Hindu philosophy and yoga, but they also incorporate elements of Western psychology and New Age spirituality.
Okay, sounds eclectic.
It is, and it's all centered around Chris Butler. He's seen as the ultimate guru, the only true path to enlightenment.
So it's not just about following a set of beliefs. It's about complete devotion to Butler himself.
That's a key part of it. And that's where some of the red flags start to pop up. There are accounts from former members describing intense pressure to conform to Butler's teachings and to isolate themselves from anyone who questions him.
So it's not just about personal belief. It's about controlling people's behavior and their social connections.
Exactly, and that aligns with one of the key elements of the BITE model, which is often used to assess potential cult behavior control.
Okay, let's unpack that. What does behavior control look like in the context of SIF?
Well, it can manifest in different ways. For example, there are reports of SEF members being told what jobs they can have, who they can be friends with, even who they can marry.
Wow, that's pretty extreme.
It is, and it's all justified under the guise of spiritual purity and following Butler's guidance.
So it's this idea that Butler knows what's best for everyone, and anyone who deviates from his path is somehow spiritually contaminated.
Yeah, that's the basic idea, and
Wow.
it creates a very controlled environment where people are constantly under pressure to conform. And that can have a really damaging impact on their sense of self and their ability to think critically.
I imagine it would be hard to even question anything when you're surrounded by people who believe so strongly in Butler's authority.
Right. It creates this echo chamber where dissenting voices are quickly silenced. And that brings us to another element of the BITE model, information control. So how does SIF control information? What are they doing to keep their members from accessing outside perspectives?
Well, for one thing, they discourage their members from reading or watching anything critical of Butler or Sif. They often portray the outside world as dangerous and corrupt, full of temptations that will lead people astray from their spiritual path.
So it's this us versus them mentality again. Only this time, it's not just about other Hare Krishna groups, it's about the entire outside world.
Right, and that makes it very difficult for members to get a balanced perspective, or to even consider the possibility that Butler might be wrong about something.
It's like they're trying to create this little bubble where Butler's word is the only truth.
Exactly, and that's a key characteristic of cult-like groups. They want to control the narrative. They want to be the sole source of information for their members. And that leads us to the next element of the BITE model, thought control.
Okay, so how do they control people's thoughts? Like, are they using mind control techniques or something? Not in the literal sense, but they do use subtle and not so subtle ways to shape how their members think. For example, they constantly reinforce the idea that Butler is the only true spiritual master, the only one who can lead people to enlightenment. They teach that all other gurus are false or misguided, and that associating with them will lead to spiritual ruin.
So it's like they're creating this black and white worldview where there's only one right path, and any deviation from that path is dangerous.
Exactly. And that kind of thinking can be incredibly limiting. It shuts down critical thinking. It makes it hard to question anything or to consider alternative perspectives.
It's like they're trying to program people to think in a very specific way.
That's a good way to put it. And that kind of thought control can have a lasting impact. Even after people leave SIF, they may struggle to break free from those ingrained thought patterns.
So we've got behavior control, information control, thought control. What's the last piece of the BITE model?
Emotional control.
Okay. So how does SIF manipulate people's emotions?
One common tactic is to instill fear. They might tell their members that if they leave SIF or disobey Butler's teachings, they'll suffer terrible consequences in this life and the next. They might also use guilt, making people feel bad for having doubts or for not being devoted enough.
So this is constant emotional pressure, this feeling like you're walking on eggshells all the time.
Right, and that can be incredibly draining. It can make people feel anxious, depressed, and even suicidal. There are former SEF members who've reported experiencing severe emotional distress as a result of this kind of manipulation.
That's really disturbing. It's clear that this is not just about harmless spiritual beliefs. We're talking about real psychological harm.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these tactics, to understand how cults operate, and to be able to recognize the warning signs.
Because these kinds of groups, they don't always advertise themselves as cults. They often present themselves as something positive and uplifting, something that will help you find meaning and purpose.
Right. They prey on people's vulnerabilities, their desire for connection, their search for truth, and they use those desires to control and exploit them.
So what can people do to protect themselves? How can they tell if a group is potentially dangerous?
That's a great question, and one that we'll delve into deeper later on. But for now, I think it's important to remember that any group that demands absolute obedience, that isolates its members, that discourages critical thinking, should raise some red flags.
Yeah, and if something feels off, if you're feeling pressured, or if you're starting to lose your sense of self, it's important to trust your gut and to seek help.
Absolutely. There are resources available for people who are struggling with cult involvement or who have loved ones in a cult. And we'll provide some links to those resources in the show notes.
Great. So we've kind of laid the groundwork here. We've talked about Chris Butler's background, the basic beliefs of Seth, and the BITE model, which helps us understand the potential cult-like dynamics at play. But there's so much more to this story. There are allegations of financial irregularities, exploitation, abuse of power, and even connections to high-profile political figures. We're going to dive into all of that in the next part of our deep dive. But first, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, this idea of subliminal indoctrination. I'm really curious about that. Can you explain a bit more about how that works?
Yeah, it's a fascinating and controversial topic. The basic idea is that Seth uses subtle techniques to influence people's thoughts and beliefs without their conscious awareness. They might embed messages in Butler's chants, or they might use specific rituals or practices that are designed to bypass people's critical thinking faculties.
So it's like brainwashing, but on a subconscious level.
Some people use that term. But it's important to remember that there's no scientific consensus on whether subliminal messaging actually works. There have been studies that suggest it can have some effect, but the results are often inconclusive.
So is this just a conspiracy theory then? Or is there something more to it?
I think it's worth considering. Even if subliminal messaging isn't effective in the way that some people claim, Seth definitely uses a lot of subtle persuasion techniques. They're very good at framing things in a way that appeals to people's emotions and desires. They create a sense of belonging, they offer a path to enlightenment, and they make Butler seem like the only one who can guide people to that destination.
So even if they're not literally brainwashing people, they're still using sophisticated psychological tactics to influence them.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole story so complex and disturbing. It's not always easy to see what's happening. It's not always clear where the line is between genuine spiritual seeking and harmful manipulation.
And that's why we need to be so careful, so critical in our thinking, so willing to question authority and to seek out multiple perspectives. Because these kinds of groups, they can be incredibly seductive. They offer simple answers to complex questions. They promise a sense of belonging and purpose.
Yeah.
And they could be very convincing, especially to people who are feeling lost or vulnerable.
Absolutely. We all want to believe that we're immune to manipulation, that we're too smart to fall for a cult. But the reality is that anyone can be vulnerable, especially if they're going through a difficult time in their lives or if they're searching for something to believe in.
Right. And that's why it's so important to talk about these things, to raise awareness and to educate ourselves about the dangers of cults and how to recognize them.
I agree. The more we know, the better equipped we are to protect ourselves and our loved ones.
Well said. All right, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll dig into the really heavy stuff, the accusations against Butler, the impact on followers, and the troubling connections to the Gabbard family.
I'm ready. This is where things start to get really interesting.
Me too. Stay tuned.
All right, so we're back. And we're about to get into some of the more serious allegations against Chris Butler and Seth.
Yeah, this is where things get really heavy.
Yeah, we're talking about financial irregularities, exploitation, abuse of power.
And let's not forget the whole Gabbard family connection.
Right, that's a big one.
Yeah.
But we'll get to that later. First, let's focus on the allegations against Butler himself.
Okay, so what are we talking about specifically?
Well, one of the biggest accusations is that he's been involved in some shady financial dealings.
Okay.
There are claims of money laundering and operating illegal pyramid schemes.
Whoa, hold on. Pyramid schemes.
Yeah.
Like those things where you recruit people and they recruit more people and it all collapses eventually.
Exactly. And there are a few specific companies that have been linked to Seth and Butler that have raised some eyebrows.
Such as?
Well, there's QNet, Goldquest, Vihan Direct Selling. These companies have all been accused of running pyramid schemes, and they all have ties to Seth.
So you're saying that people who join SIF might also be pressured to get involved in these businesses?
That's what some former members have alleged. They say that they were encouraged to invest in these companies and to recruit others, often with the promise of big financial rewards.
But if it's a pyramid scheme, the only people who really make money are the ones at the top right.
Right, and there have been numerous complaints and lawsuits filed against these companies. Some have even been shut down or banned in certain countries.
So this is not just some small-time operation. We're talking about potentially millions of dollars.
Exactly. And it raises serious questions about where all that money is going and who's really benefiting from it.
Right, because if SIF is a nonprofit religious organization, they shouldn't be profiting from these kinds of businesses, especially if they're illegal.
Exactly. And then there are allegations of exploitation. Former members have said that they were required to work long hours for little or no pay, often in businesses owned by high-ranking SIF members.
So it's like they're using their followers as free labor.
That's the accusation. And it's not just about manual labor. Some former members have said that they were pressured to use their professional skills, like accounting or marketing, to benefit SIF or Butler's businesses.
So they're not just exploiting people's time and energy, they're also exploiting their talents and skills.
Right. And it creates this really unhealthy power dynamic where people feel like they have to do whatever Butler asks of them, even if it means sacrificing their own well-being.
And that's a classic cult tactic, creating a sense of dependency, making people feel like they can't survive without the group.
Exactly. And then there are the accusations of abuse of power.
Okay, what kind of abuse are we talking about here?
Well, former members have accused Butler of using his position to control and manipulate his followers. They say he dictated their career paths, their relationships, even their personal lives.
So it's like he's playing God, deciding who people can marry, what jobs they can have, how they should live their lives.
It's a pretty extreme level of control, and there are specific examples that have been cited, like Butler allegedly pressuring young women to marry older men within the group or forbidding couples from having children without his permission.
Wow, that's really disturbing.
Yeah.
And I imagine it would be really hard to speak out against this kind of abuse when you're in that environment.
Absolutely. Butler is seen as this infallible guru, this divine being, and anyone who questions him is seen as a traitor or worse, a demon.
So there's this culture of fear and silence that makes it really difficult for people to come forward.
Right, and that's why it's taken so long for these allegations to surface. It's only in recent years that former members have started to speak out more openly about what they experienced.
And I imagine it's really difficult for them to relive those experiences, to face the backlash from SIF, to try to rebuild their lives.
It is incredibly difficult, but it's also incredibly brave because by speaking out, they're helping to shed light on what's really going on within SIF, and they're giving hope to others who might be struggling in silence.
Absolutely. So we've got financial irregularities, exploitation, abuse of power. But there's one more big piece of this puzzle that we need to talk about, the Gabbard family.
Right. This is where things get really interesting and potentially very troubling.
Because Tulsi Gabbard, the former congresswoman, she's been very open about her Hindu faith, and she's never denied her connection to SIF.
Right, and her parents, Mike and Carol Gabbard, they're both longtime members of SIF.
And there have been reports of significant campaign contributions from SIF members to Gabbard's political campaigns.
Yeah, and that raises some serious concerns about potential influence. Is SIF trying to gain political power through Gabbard? Are they using her to advance their own agenda?
And Gabbard has faced criticism for her close ties to Butler. Some people have called her a cult apologist or accused her of being a secret SIF member.
Right. And it's a complicated issue because Gabbard has always maintained that she's a practicing Catholic, even though she's also very involved in Hindu practices.
So she's kind of straddling these two different worlds, which makes it hard to know where her true allegiances lie.
Exactly. And it raises questions about her judgment and about whether she's been completely transparent with the public about her beliefs and her affiliations.
Right, because if she's a SIF member or she's being influenced by SIF, that could have serious implications for her political decisions.
Absolutely. And it's something that voters have a right to know about.
So where do we go from here? What are the next steps in this investigation?
Well, I think it's important to continue to gather evidence, to talk to more former SIF members, to investigate the financial dealings of SIF and its associated businesses, and to look into the Gabbard family connection more deeply.
And we need to keep asking the tough questions, holding people accountable, and demanding transparency.
Absolutely. Because this is not just about Chris Butler or SIF or even Tulsi Gabbard. This is about the dangers of cults, the importance of critical thinking, and the need to protect ourselves and our communities from manipulation and exploitation.
Well said. All right, we've covered a lot of ground in this part, but we're not done yet. In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to explore the psychological impact of SIF's teachings on its followers, and we'll try to understand why people get drawn to these kinds of groups in the first place.
And we'll also talk about what can be done to help people who are struggling with cult involvement or who have loved ones in a cult.
So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation. And I think it's time to really grapple with the human side of this story. We've talked about the allegations, the manipulation, the potential cult-like tactics. But why do people get sucked into this kind of thing in the first place?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's not an easy one to answer, but I think it's important to remember that people who join cults aren't stupid. They're not weak-minded. They're often intelligent and idealistic people who are searching for something.
Searching for what?
Meaning purpose, connection, a sense of belonging. Maybe they're going through a tough time in their lives. Maybe they're feeling lost or disillusioned. And cults offer this really seductive package.
Like a quick fix.
Kind of. They promise instant community, a clear set of beliefs, a charismatic leader who seems to have all the answers.
Right.
And for someone who's struggling, that can be incredibly appealing.
So it's not so much about being brainwashed as it is about finding something that fills a void.
Exactly. And cults are really good at exploiting those vulnerabilities. They create this environment where you feel loved and accepted, but only as long as you conform.
And if you don't,
then you're out. You're a traitor. You're a demon. You're cut off from the community that you've come to rely on.
So there's this constant pressure to stay in line.
Right. And that pressure can be incredibly intense, especially when it's backed up by spiritual threats. Like if you leave the group, you'll be reincarnated as a cockroach or something.
Yeah, I remember reading about that in some of the SIF material. It's pretty intense.
It is. And it's designed to keep people in line, to make them afraid to question or to leave.
So how do people break free from this kind of control?
It's not easy. It often takes a major life event, a crisis of faith, a moment of clarity where they realize that something isn't right.
And even then, it must be terrifying to leave knowing that you're cutting yourself off from everything you know.
Absolutely. It's a huge risk, and there's often a lot of shame and guilt involved. People feel like they've failed, or that they're betraying their beliefs.
So what can we do to help people who are in these situations?
Well, the first step is to educate ourselves about how cults operate, to be able to recognize the warning signs. And then we need to create a space where people feel safe to come forward to share their experiences without judgment.
Because a lot of times people are afraid to talk about it.
Yeah.
They're worried that they won't be believed or that they'll be blamed.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be compassionate, to listen without judgment, and to offer support.
And I think it's also important to remember that this is not just some fringe phenomenon. Cults are more common than we think, and they can target anyone.
Absolutely. It's not about intelligence or education or social status. Anyone can be vulnerable to manipulation, especially if they're going through a difficult time or if they're searching for something to believe in.
So what's the takeaway here? What do you hope listeners will remember from this deep dive?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we need to be critical thinkers. We need to question everything, especially when it comes to groups that demand absolute obedience or that make grandiose promises.
And we need to be willing to have uncomfortable conversations, to talk about these issues, even if it's difficult, because silence only protects the abusers.
Exactly. We need to break the silence, to shine a light on these dark corners, and to create a world where people feel empowered to speak out against manipulation and exploitation.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to thank you for joining us on this journey. It's been a heavy one, but I think it's an important one.
I agree. And I hope that it sparked some critical thinking and maybe even inspired some action.
Absolutely. Because we all have a responsibility to protect ourselves and our communities from these kinds of harmful groups.
And remember, there are resources available for people who are struggling with cult involvement or who have loved ones in a cult. We'll provide some links to those resources in the show notes.
Great. And if you or someone you know needs help, please don't hesitate to reach out. There are people who care and who want to help.
And remember, you're not alone.
Thanks for listening, and stay skeptical out there.